The Senate thought they were getting a celebrity cameo. What they got instead was Denzel Washington walking into a room with a medal, a letter, and a quiet fury that would dismantle Senator Mike Lee's entire reputation, layer by layer. What happened next wasn't just a confrontation. It was a reckoning that shook even the walls of Congress. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The room didn't just go quiet, it went still, like someone had pressed pause on the air itself. Staffers froze mid-step. A senator lowered his coffee without realizing he hadn't taken a sip. The C-SPAN camera operators, usually robotic in their focus, subtly panned away from the dais and toward the tall man walking in at the back of the hearing room. He wasn't on the list of witnesses, not formally. And yet no one stopped him. Denzel Washington wasn't wearing a suit like the lobbyists in the back or a badge like the congressional aides. He wore a dark, weathered jacket, the kind that spoke of long walks and quiet resistance. In one hand, he carried a small, worn leather notebook. The cover was frayed at the edges. The kind of notebook that didn't come from a store, but from a drawer you hadn't opened in years. His other hand was empty. But the weight he brought with him needed no introduction. Senator Mike Lee noticed him immediately. He leaned sideways and muttered to the junior senator beside him, with a half-smirk barely hidden behind his Harvard-polished condescension. "Hollywood sent their best," he said under his breath. Another actor thinking he understands the Constitution. He wasn't entirely wrong. Denzel Washington had played lawyers before, soldiers, revolutionaries. Men who stood up to power and paid the price. But this time he wasn't playing anyone. There was no script, and whatever brought him here today, it wasn't applause. The chairman cleared his throat, clearly caught off guard by the presence but unwilling to challenge it. The hearing was public, technically open, and the cameras were already rolling. "Mr. Washington, thank you for joining us. I believe you've been asked to provide supplemental testimony." Denzel stepped up to the microphone, his steps slow, deliberate. He didn't look at the chairman. His eyes scanned the room, not the architecture, but the people, the aides in the back, the clerks. The janitor in the corner, still holding his mop like he'd forgotten to leave. He looked up at the senators like a man who had sat in silence long enough. "Thank you, Senator," he said. "I won't take much of your time." His voice was even low, but it carried, not like an actor on stage. Like a man who had spent decades listening to people explain power as if they invented it. "I'm not here as a celebrity, not as a performer. I'm here as the son of a man who couldn't finish high school because he had to work 3 jobs to keep us alive. A man who mopped floors in buildings like this one. Who read the Constitution in between shifts, not because he had to pass an exam, but because he was trying to understand why the country he fought for still treated him like a ghost." There was a pause. A long one, the kind of silence that didn't ask permission. Senator Lee shifted in his chair, glancing toward his staffer for some confirmation that this was all part of the agenda. The staffer shrugged, quietly opening the binder in front of him, flipping pages in vain. "This wasn't on the script," Denzel continued. "My father used to clean the floors of the Capitol, not metaphorically, literally. Sometimes he'd come home with mop water still on his shoes. He told me once, and I remember this like scripture, that he used to stop in front of the old framed Constitution they kept near the north exit. He'd look at it and whisper the words, not loud, just enough to remind himself they were real. Another pause, not for drama, for gravity. He'd whisper the First Amendment while pushing a mop. A faint sound of a phone buzzing in the back of the chamber was quickly silenced. Even the stenographer looked up. Denzel held up the notebook in his hand. This was his. "I found it after he passed. It's full of questions." Questions he never had time to ask. And I figured, if no one in this room has the courage to answer them, maybe I'll ask them myself. Senator Lee scoffed quietly, but it didn't matter. "I didn't come here to perform," Denzel said, turning his eyes to Lee directly. "I came here with the questions of a man who scrubbed the marble under your feet and still believed in the words above your head." And just like that, the room forgot to breathe again. The chairman shifted in his seat. The room, though silent, began to breathe again, but only barely. Senator Mike Lee tapped his pen twice on the table, glanced sideways at the C-SPAN cameras, and then leaned into his microphone with a rehearsed half-smile. Mr. Washington, he began, his tone laced with that polished kind of civility that always comes before a condescension. I want to thank you for sharing your deeply personal family story. Truly, it was moving. A pause. The kind that comes before the pivot. But with all due respect to your distinguished career in entertainment, this is a Senate hearing. We are here to discuss voting legislation, constitutional principles, the role of federal oversight. Not to relitigate personal grievances or perform monologues. This isn't a movie set. This is the United States Congress. A few Republican aides in the back chuckled, not loudly, just enough. Enough for the cameras not to catch, but for everyone in the room to feel. Denzel stood still. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He waited like a man who had heard this tone before in offices, in courtrooms, in waiting rooms where certain names got called and others waited until the lights dimmed. He leaned forward slightly, placing the leather notebook gently on the witness table. Then he looked directly at Lee, not through him, into him. Senator, he said, you're absolutely right. This isn't a movie set, and I'm not here to perform. He paused just long enough to let the words settle, then continued. But you mentioned something just now, something about federal oversight, constitutional roles. That reminded me of something. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges. This is a copy of a visitor log to the Library of Congress dated June 27, 1988. That summer, if memory serves, you were a rising sophomore interning on the Hill. The log shows you spent several afternoons there, likely researching legal theory or case law. Very admirable. Lee raised his eyebrows but said nothing. Denzel looked down at the page, then back up. That same summer, my father was working nights in that same library, not as a scholar, as a janitor. He was the man cleaning the floors you walked across on your way to study the Constitution. There was a hush, a shift in air pressure. Even those who wanted to dismiss him knew what was coming next wasn't scripted. He told me once, this is maybe 20 years ago, that one night he found a student's forgotten notebook on a reading desk. He read a line from it, a quote from James Madison, something about how knowledge would forever govern ignorance. He copied it down in his own notebook and left the original untouched. I asked him why. He said because maybe that student would grow up to use that quote in a courtroom one day, or worse, in Congress. Senator Lee's lips tightened. He looked down, flipped a page that didn't need flipping. I didn't know until this morning, Denzel said, voice steady, that the student was you. A reporter in the back of the chamber stopped typing. Another turned on their recorder. The room had become a wound, and silence was the antiseptic. Denzel leaned back slightly. I'm not saying that to embarrass you. I'm saying it to illustrate something deeper. You and I walked through the same building. You were being groomed for power. My father was being told to be invisible. You studied words written by slave owners who became founders. My father cleaned around their marble likenesses and wondered if their promises included him. Senator Lee adjusted his glasses. His jaw clenched, but still he stayed silent. You said earlier this isn't a place for performance. I agree. That's why I left acting out of it. What I brought instead are memories, and memories have their own authority, Senator, one that doesn't require confirmation from your syllabus. Another pause, another silence that pressed against the marble walls. You learned law from books. I learned justice from the smell of bleach on the floor of this Capitol. And I promise you this, only one of those lessons ever made a man whole. Denzel let the words hang. No flourish, no crescendo, just the truth, simple, unadorned, and undeniable. Denzel reached into the notebook again, slower this time, like he wasn't just retrieving paper but waking something that had been asleep for far too long. His fingers pressed gently between the pages as if careful not to tear what was fragile, and he unfolded a creased document with two hands. The paper had aged into a soft tan color, the edges curling like the corners of a photograph left too long in a box no one dared to open. He held it up not for the senators, but for the C-SPAN camera pointed directly at him. This, he said quietly, is a voter registration rejection form. Dated September 4, 1946. It belonged to my father. He laid the document flat on the table. The microphone caught the soft friction of paper against wood. The room leaned in. He had served in the army 2 years earlier, came home wearing a uniform and carrying a letter of commendation. thought that counted for something. Apparently, it didn't, because when he tried to register to vote in Georgia, he was denied. Not because he was a felon, not because he failed to fill out the paperwork, but because, according to the registrar's handwritten note, he had not demonstrated sufficient understanding of the political system. There it was, the phrase, scribbled in blue ink at the bottom of the form, sufficient understanding. As if democracy were a private club with a written exam, as if his blood overseas had been spilled in the wrong language. Senator Lee gave a short breath through his nose, not quite a sigh, not quite a laugh. Just enough to signal what he was about to say next. He leaned into his mic. "Mr. Washington, I do appreciate the gravity of what your father went through, and I recognize the painful history of voter discrimination in this country. But you must also understand literacy tests, for all their flaws, were legal in many states for decades. Flawed, yes, but within the framework of the law at the time." Denzel looked up slowly. He didn't blink. "So was segregation, Senator." Lee didn't respond. "And so was redlining, and banning women from the vote, and prohibiting Native Americans from being counted as citizens. All of it legal. All of it codified, justified, reinforced by men who wrote laws faster than they wrote remorse." Lee opened his mouth as if to interrupt, but Denzel didn't pause. "When you hide behind legality, Senator, you give cover to cruelty, you sanctify oppression, you call it order, but make no mistake, it's still a weapon." He tapped the paper on the table twice, not with aggression, with finality. "My father couldn't recite all the branches of government. He didn't know the details of the Commerce Clause. But he knew what justice looked like, or more importantly, what it didn't." He paused, not for drama, for breath, for truth to settle. "He once told me, son, they didn't deny me the vote because I didn't know politics. They denied me because they knew I did, that I knew enough to see through the lie, that the system wasn't broken. It was built that way." The room froze again, but this time the silence came with weight. Even those who opposed him didn't move, didn't speak, because the air had changed, not just the mood, the oxygen. Denzel leaned forward. "Senator, I've listened to you speak for years about federalism, about original intent, about protecting the sanctity of state authority. But when the states use that authority to turn voting into a privilege instead of a right, they're not preserving democracy. They're perverting it." Lee shifted in his seat, trying to conjure a reply, but Denzel wasn't finished. "You say you respect the pain, but pain without accountability is just pageantry. You say law is law. But if that law only protects people who look like you, think like you, pray like you, then it's not law, it's a sieve, a filter, designed not to serve but to select." He sat back, hands folded now, voice even. "And if democracy can be filtered, Senator, then it was never democracy at all." A murmur passed through the back of the room. Someone coughed to cover it. Another staffer whispered into a phone and quickly hung up. Reporters typed faster. The hearing had turned. This was no longer about policy. It was about memory, and who had the right to claim it. Lee adjusted his microphone again, clearing his throat. "Mr. Washington, I understand the emotional impact of what you've shared. But we cannot make policy based on feelings. The Constitution is not a vessel for trauma. It is a legal framework, and within that framework we must make decisions based on principle, not passion." Denzel looked at him. "Senator, the Constitution is not a shield for indifference. It is a promise. And when that promise is broken, generation after generation, it doesn't become meaningless. It becomes a debt." He placed the rejection form gently back into his notebook. "And I'm here to collect." The room didn't gasp. It didn't cheer. It just held its breath, again, because it knew. Somewhere between the paper and the blood, something had been revealed. And it couldn't be unspoken. Denzel stayed quiet longer than usual this time. His hand rested gently on the notebook, fingers tracing its spine like it held something alive. The senators were shifting now, some whispering to aides, some staring at nothing. Lee's jaw was clenched tight, as if holding back 1,000 words he hadn't yet figured out how to defend. Denzel finally looked up. "Senator," he said slowly, "you've spoken a lot about your father, about legacy." I listened. "And I believe legacies matter. But sometimes what we inherit isn't just pride. Sometimes it's silence. And silence, if left too long, becomes a kind of complicity. He opened the notebook again, more gently than before, and pulled out another folded sheet of paper. This one thinner, more brittle. The ink slightly faded, the handwriting old and careful. He held it in one hand and read, his voice lower now, like reading to ghosts. March 3rd, 1929, Salt Lake County. My application to vote was denied today. The clerk asked me to write out the phrase, freedom of conscience, from memory. I misspelled conscience. Left out the second C, he said that meant I lacked sufficient understanding of liberty. Denzel looked up, locking eyes with Lee. This entry, he said, was written by Josiah Lee, your grandfather. Lee stiffened. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Then finally, almost defensive, that can't be right. I don't know anything about this. Denzel nodded slowly. That's what I figured. Because history doesn't disappear, Senator, it gets buried. And sometimes the people who bury it are the ones who benefit most from forgetting. He placed the paper down beside the rejection form from his father. 2 generations, 2 denials, different states. Same excuse. I didn't find this in some archive. I found it in a university collection of oral histories. Josiah Lee recorded 4 interviews in the 1960s. Never aired. The transcripts were digitized last year. Nobody looked twice. Because no one expected a man who shared your name to have once been turned away from the very system you now defend without question. Lee was visibly unsettled now. He leaned forward into his microphone. I don't know what you're implying, Mr. Washington, but I had no knowledge of any of this. My grandfather never told me any of that. He was a patriot. A proud American, Denzel cut him off, not with volume, with clarity, so was mine. Lee froze. The difference is I was told the truth. Ugly, yes, but honest. And that truth shaped how I see this country, how I speak about it. How I refuse to pretend the rules have always been fair. He gestured toward the paper again. Your grandfather was denied his vote because of a spelling mistake. And here you are, nearly a century later, defending the kinds of laws that would let that happen again. Maybe not in ink, but in spirit, through ID requirements, through roll purges, through closing polling stations in places that look more like where my father lived than where you vacation. Lee sat back, his lips pressed thin. Denzel let the moment hang. You said earlier that trauma shouldn't guide legislation. But Senator, trauma didn't write these laws. Indifference did. Trauma is what's left behind. It's what families pass down when no one else listens. He glanced at the 2 pages before him. These are not props, they're not dramatics, they are receipts. One from my blood, one from yours. The room was so quiet the hum of fluorescent lights became a kind of static. You can say you didn't know, that's fine. But knowing is only the first part. The real test is what you do once you do know. Lee looked away. Because if you choose silence now, Denzel said, still watching him, you're not just forgetting Josiah Lee. You're betraying him. Reporters didn't type. They stared. The clerk by the door shifted in his chair but didn't leave. Even the guards stood a little straighter. And if you betray your own blood, Senator, Denzel added, what hope is there for the rest of us? He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He had handed Mike Lee a mirror, and the reflection was not what the senator had prepared to see. Legacy is a burden, Denzel said finally. The question is not whether you carry it. The question is whether you dare to look inside and ask who paid for it. And for a moment, Mike Lee, the son of a judge, the grandson of a man who once misspelled conscience and paid for it with his vote, had nothing left to say. Denzel didn't speak at first. He simply reached into his bag and pulled out a small black device, slightly worn at the corners. He placed it on the table, pressed a button, and turned the speaker toward the room. There was a faint hiss of static, then a voice, youthful, eager, but unmistakably familiar, crackled to life. A recording began to play. The date was April 1993. The location was Brigham Young University. The voice belonged to a 21-year-old Mike Lee. And I quote, "Why do we dedicate an entire month to this idea of collective guilt? Black History Month, they call it. But let's be honest, it's really a month of national self-flagellation where we're asked to apologize for things we never did to people we never harmed." There was an awkward shift in the hearing room. Some listeners narrowed their eyes. Others glanced at their phones or toward the exits, unsure of what they had just heard, or what might come next. The recording continued, Lee's voice now rising with confidence. We should be celebrating the greatness of the American spirit, not apologizing for its imperfections. If we keep bowing our heads for sins of the past, we'll forget how to stand for what's right today. Then the audio cut off. No outro, no applause, just a thin hum of dead air. Mike Lee's face flushed. For a moment, it wasn't the senator sitting in that chair. It was the student, the one who had never expected those words to follow him this far. He leaned into the mic. That was over 30 years ago. I was young, naive. I didn't yet understand the full weight of our history. I've grown since then. Denzel looked at him, steady, so did we. He let that sentence sit for a moment, then leaned slightly forward. You were 21, not a child. Old enough to vote. Old enough to speak in front of hundreds. Old enough to make declarations about who deserves to feel pain and who deserves to dismiss it. Lee didn't respond. His jaw tightened again, the old defense building back up brick by brick. Denzel continued. The problem isn't that you were young. The problem is that you spoke like someone who was certain. Certain that a month meant for remembering was an attack. Certain that reflection was a threat. And that certainty, Senator, is what you carried into adulthood. He gestured toward the senators seated around him. Because that voice, the one from BYU, is not that different from the one we've heard in these chambers. The vocabulary changed, the tone softened, but the message stayed the same. A young staffer in the back of the room closed his laptop slowly, as if processing something he had never questioned before. You said we shouldn't dwell in the sins of the past. But I say this, memory is not dwelling, it's witnessing. And if we forget how to witness, we forget how to prevent. Lee finally spoke again, this time more composed. You're weaponizing my past. That's what this is. I've spent my life defending the Constitution. You're dragging up an old speech to score political points. Denzel shook his head gently. No, Senator, I'm not weaponizing your past. I'm exposing the blueprint, the one that shaped your present. The one that explains why you dismiss voter suppression as a myth. Why you frame equality efforts as overreach. Why you defend laws that always seem to fall hardest on the very people that month was meant to remember. He turned to the camera now, not for performance, but for clarity. We're not just debating policy. We're debating memory, whose memory counts, whose memory gets printed in textbooks, and whose gets filed away under too emotional, too inconvenient, too black. Lee was silent again. Denzel faced him once more. You say you were young, that's fine. Growth is allowed, but growth requires acknowledgement, regret. And I've yet to hear either, just explanations. Another pause. We're not old enough to forget, Senator. And you're not young enough to excuse. The room stayed still. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from boredom but from pressure. Like the weight of something unspoken had just shifted into full view. Denzel turned off the recorder and placed it back in his bag. Not triumphantly, not dramatically, just with finality. Truth, he said, doesn't expire, it waits. And today it spoke. Denzel reached into the inner lining of his coat. This time there was no hesitation, no need to build toward it. His hand came out holding something small but heavy, glinting dully under the fluorescent lights. It was a metal, bronze, circular, weathered by time. He placed it on the table with care, not ceremony. The sound it made was soft, but it landed like a stone dropped in water. Ripples began the moment it touched the wood. This, he said, belonged to my father. The inscription was visible even from a distance. Normandy, 1944. United States Army. He didn't talk about the war much, Denzel continued. Not because he was ashamed, but because coming home felt worse than anything he saw overseas. He told me once that the beach he stormed in France was less hostile than the courthouse back in Georgia. A few senators shifted uncomfortably. No one interrupted. He fought for a country that didn't fight for him, risked his life for a flag that made him prove he deserved the right to vote. Not once, not twice. 3 times he was turned away, each time for a different reason. Wrong address. Incomplete paperwork. And once, this is real, because he didn't write enough words in an essay on the branches of government. Denzel let that sit. A man who survived bullets was failed by a pen. He looked at the medal not like it was a prize, but like it was a receipt. He thought, naively, maybe, that blood was the price of citizenship. That putting your body between your country and its enemies was enough to be seen as American. But it turns out for some of us you have to keep proving it, over and over. In writing, in silence, in the way you nod politely when someone tells you the system is fair. There was no sound in the room. Even the machines in the press row seemed to hum more quietly, as if ashamed to record. He looked back at Senator Lee. You sit here talking about principle, about the purity of law. But what principle lets a man fight fascism abroad only to be failed by democracy at home? What purity lives in that silence? Lee didn't answer, couldn't. His eyes flicked toward the metal. Then away. Denzel didn't push. He didn't raise his voice. He simply continued, each word now less like an argument and more like a reading of the verdict. He didn't ask for favors, just for fairness. He believed in the idea that if you bled for the Constitution, you earned a place under it. But the people at the desk looked at his skin before they looked at his name. They read him before they read the form. A deep breath, not dramatic. Just necessary. He carried that rejection like a wound you can't show anyone. It changed him, and he never told me that directly. But I saw it in the way he paused before saying the pledge. The way he stood outside the polling place one last time and then walked away without trying again. That was the last year he even attempted. Lee blinked slowly. His face was unreadable, but something had shifted, not visibly, but inward. Like a pillar under pressure, cracks invisible from a distance, but felt. Denzel pointed to the metal one last time. This wasn't a prop, it was a promise, one the country made to him and broke, repeatedly. He looked around the room. Not just at the senators, at the staffers, the guards, the aides, the people who never make the transcripts. Some of you had grandfathers who got medals and votes. Mine got one and not the other. And if we don't see the cruelty in that imbalance, if we don't name it, then we are not preserving history. We are embalming injustice. There was still no reply, not from Lee, not from anyone. Even the chairman had lowered his pen. That silence, Denzel said finally, is not neutrality, it's a verdict. And then he said nothing else. The room didn't move, time didn't either. For a moment everything stopped. Not out of confusion, but because everyone knew. The performance was over. The pageantry was over. What remained was truth. And truth, once spoken plainly, needs no applause, only reckoning. Denzel didn't reach for the notebook again. He didn't lift the medal or return to the stories that had already hollowed out the room. He just leaned toward the microphone, calm, still, eyes steady. And for the first time, his voice carried something different, not grief. Not accusation, something quieter, something final. I was never elected to sit in this room, he said. I don't have a title, no staff, no committee, but I have this. He touched the microphone, and I've learned how to turn it on. The phrase landed softly, but it didn't stay soft. It moved out of the room into the hallway, into the live stream. By the time he stood up, the quote had already been clipped, time-stamped, and sent to millions. He nodded to the chairman. Offered no further statement, just a silent nod. Then he picked up the medal, folded the notebook, and walked out the same way he had come in. No escort, no grand exit, just footsteps, even, measured. Echoing against marble that had been polished by men like his father, the senators didn't speak. Mike Lee didn't speak. And that was the real shift, not in laws, not in votes, but in silence. The kind that didn't feel like control anymore. The kind that felt like surrender. Hours later, the clip was everywhere. On CNN, anchors stumbled over the timeline, rushing to contextualize the calm man with the notebook who had just dismantled a sitting senator with family archives and silence. On the BBC, a historian called it a moral landmark, the kind of testimony that doesn't just expose a system. It reshapes the cultural mirror it hides behind. At the United Nations, an American diplomat was asked about the hearing. He paused, looked away, and simply said, I think we heard something more honest than anything we've said here this year. That night, Brigham Young University issued a statement. It was brief, regretful. It withdrew an honorary speaking invitation to Senator Lee, citing evolving concerns about past rhetoric inconsistent with the values of inclusion and accountability. Some called it cancel culture, others called it long overdue consequence. But for those who had watched the hearing live, it didn't feel like punishment. It felt like balance. And then something unexpected happened. A group of congressional aides, mostly interns, mostly young, circulated a petition. They weren't asking for a bill or a resolution. They were asking for a plaque, something permanent, something quiet, something honest. Weeks later, a small bronze plate was installed in the Library of Congress, near the same hallway where Mike Lee once studied, and Denzel's father once mopped the floors. It read, "You learned law from books. I learned justice from the smell of bleach on the floor of this Capitol, and I promise you, only one of those lessons ever made a man whole." Underneath, just 2 lines. Denzel Washington. Congressional hearing, 2025. People came, not in crowds, just one by one. A janitor on break, a student with earbuds, a tourist who stopped mid-tour to read. No hashtags, no flash, just memory etched in metal, left to breathe. As for Senator Lee, he stayed quiet. No follow-up interviews, no press op-eds. Some said he was waiting for the moment to pass. Others said the moment had passed him, but the truth was simpler. Sometimes, when a microphone is finally turned on, it doesn't just project a voice. It rewrites who gets to be heard. And that day, it wasn't a senator. It wasn't a committee. It was a son carrying a story his father had never been allowed to tell. And when he told it, the whole room listened. And then the world did too.